Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, I would like to begin by stating that the purpose of this pretrial motion is not to exclude all of the testimony given by my client on the night of April 19th. The purpose of this motion is simply to exclude the statement that she gives after the questioning becomes accusatory and custody is attached.
When is that, counsel?
During the course of the investigation, Officer Wright makes a statement, and I quote, "Well, we think it's possible that you were the one that you were driving the vehicle that struck the bicyclist on Skyline to Grand tonight." At that point, the questioning did become accusatory, and everything beyond that point, we would like the defense respectfully request that that be excluded from its testimony, and that's what the purpose of this pretrial motion is.
Very well.
Your Honor, I'd like to begin with the Supreme Court case People v. Aguilera, which established 3 questions that the totality of circumstances test considers. The first being whether or not the person was free to leave. In this case, objectively speaking, no, my client was not free to leave during the course of the questioning that occurred that night. The second being...
well, I'm going to stop you right there. How do you know that your client was not free to leave?
Well, Your Honor, the questioning that took place was in the back of a locked police cruiser on separate sides of a cage. Now, objectively speaking, because those doors were locked, my client was not free to leave. She could not have left at any point during that questioning without having the officer get out and physically release her. She was not, by her own means, free to leave.
Well, okay, but did she ever attempt to leave?
No, Your Honor, but what we're going to see is that she wasn't free to leave, not because, both in a physical sense, but also because she did not feel free to leave at any time. And then it becomes in a mental sense as well.
Okay. Carry on.
Also, Your Honor, People v. Aguilera looks at whether or not the person was questioned as a suspect or a witness. Ms. Adrian Vega at that time was most definitely questioned as a suspect. The only other testimony that the police had gathered at that point was from Ms. Tony DeLuca, who had stated that Ms. Vega was the driver of the car at that time. Now,
well, okay. Really, okay, we know that there was a hit and run, there's no issue with that. We know that the hit and runs with your client's car, there's no issue with that. We know that there's 2 people in that car, either it was Tony DeLuca and your client. So, I mean, the police, by the time they interviewed your client, they were pretty narrowed down as to what the issue was in this case, correct?
Well, yes, Your Honor, but in addition to the fact that Ms. Tony DeLuca pointed towards my client as being the driver of that car, we also refer back to that accusatory statement that says that the police think that she was the one that was driving the car that night.
What is that accusatory statement?
The Officer Wright said, and again I quote, "Well, we think it's possible that you were the one that was driving the car that struck the bicyclist on Skyline and Grand tonight."
Okay. How is that accusatory? Because it sounds like that officer is just merely saying, we think it's possible that you're the one that was driving.
Well, Your Honor, because at that point, the officer voices their opinion that, or their suspicion rather, that my client was the one that was driving the car at that point. It's inherently accusatory because anybody who hears that they're being told that they're the ones that are being suspected of being a possible driver in an accident that struck a bicyclist, they're going to feel in an accused position, a defensive position, because of the inherent accusatory nature of that statement.
Okay.
And in addition to that, Your Honor, we don't just look at what the statement in itself, we look at how it was given. This statement was presented to my client through 2 separate sides of a cage in the back of a locked police cruiser in a space that's this big by this big. So in that situation, my client's going to feel inherently in a defensive position, and being told in those kinds of circumstances that they think that you were the one that was driving is inherently accusatory.
Carry on.
Your Honor, we also look at were the officers accusatory or confrontational. Again, I would like to refer back to that statement and the context it was given in. We have to look at not only the statement itself, but the fact that it was given in the back of a locked police cruiser by a uniformed officer late at night after a long series of events that had occurred that night. If you look at all those things together and combined with that accusatory statement, then yes, the officers were confrontational accusatory.
Well, how is it that your client found her way in the back of that patrol car?
Due to the location and the time that the interrogation took place, it was cold outside. I will concede that my client does mention that it's cold, but at no point is she the one that suggests that she wants to enter the police cruiser. What happens is Officer Wright is the one who suggests that they enter the back of the police cruiser. And going further beyond that, during the beginning of the questioning that takes place in the back of that police cruiser, the door remains open, and therefore that gives my client easy and obvious accessibility to her ability to leave. But at some point during the line of questioning, Officer Wright walks by and shuts that door, therefore closing off my client to her free access to terminating the questioning and leaving.
Well, looking at the statement of facts in this case that was presented by both sides, it appears to me that it wasn't that all of a sudden Officer Wright decided, hey, why don't we just go in the back of the police cruiser and decide, and talk about this further. There's some objective indicators to Officer Wright that showed that your client was not comfortable. She was shaking. She was portraying herself as somebody that was cold, not in a very comfortable environment. And so merely Officer Wright suggested, not ordered, not demanded, not took her by the hand and made her go to the police cruiser, but rather suggested that she go somewhere where she'd be more comfortable. Isn't that true?
Yes, Your Honor. But the problem here is that Officer Wright chose the most restrictive of the options that were available during the course of this interrogation. The reason that my client is outside in the cold air is because at some point during the walk she had taken previous to the line of questioning, she lost her keys. Why didn't Officer Wright offer to allow her to find her keys and continue the investigation inside the defendant's car, or allow my client to open the door to her home and continue the investigation or the questioning in my client's home? Or why didn't she let my client sit in the front seat of the police cruiser? Why does the questioning have to take place on separate sides of what was essentially a cage? It seems that there were an abundance of other options that were available to Officer Wright at the time of this questioning, but instead Officer Wright chooses to suggest what is most obviously the most restrictive location possible to continue the questioning.
All right, continue.
In addition to the People v. Aguilera, we also would like to look at the People v. Herndon, which considered a number of things that are not dispositive, but are definitely considered when we're talking about whether or not a person is in custody. Beginning with that as a side of the interrogation. Again, when we're looking at where this investigation or where this interrogation takes place, it's in the back of a locked police cruiser. My client has no free accessibility to terminate the questioning. The only way she can leave is if she asks the officer, and the officer willingly gets out of the car and lets her out. In addition to that, it is a cage car. It's again, as I stated, Your Honor, it's no bigger than 5 feet across and a few feet high. There's no way for her to stand up, stretch around, take a little bit of a walk, which would be even more accessible to her were she in an interrogation room at a police station. In addition to that, Your Honor, we'll look at whether or not objective indicia of arrest are present. Again, she's placed in a situation that severely restricts her physical liberties. In addition to that, Your Honor, we have another officer that's present during this case, Officer Jackson, who is described in the case material to be a 6'5" former college wrestler, and he's standing outside this police vehicle, essentially standing guard in case my client somehow were to get free of her situation and attempt to leave. Well, that's obviously an indicator of being in some sort of custody.
I'm not sure if the statement of facts really is clear on that fact, but okay, let's take this one factor at a time. You're saying that that there are objective indicia of arrest present, right?
Yes, Your Honor.
Now, based on the Herndon case, isn't it true? Well, in that case, where was the defendant?
In People v. Herndon?
Yes.
I believe the defendant was...
All right, let me ask you this way.
Oh, that took place in the defendant's own vehicle in that situation.
Okay.
All the questioning in or around the defendant's vehicle.
The defendant in that case had handcuffs on.
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. And your client in this case does not have handcuffs on.
No, Your Honor, she's not.
So I don't really see that there's that much objective indicia of arrest present. I mean, if you're citing the Herndon case saying, the court says let's look at the objective indicia of arrest. In that case, the defendant was in the car, but also handcuffed. In this case, the defendant was in the car, arguably due to her preference and comfort, and to make her comfortable, and not handcuffed, right?
Yes, Your Honor. But what we have in our present case is different from Herndon. Is in Herndon, questioning took place not only in the defendant's car, both in and outside of it. There are two sets of questioning, lines of questioning that do occur during this night. The lengthier one and the one that took place for the longest amount of time does occur in the back of a police cruiser. I feel like that's a bigger indicator of custody than just being even handcuffed in your own car. At least you're familiar with your availability to get out. You know how to unlock the door. In this case, Miss Vega, there's no way for her to leave if she wanted to. She'd have to have asked the officer to physically let her out.
All right, but again, we're also talking about 30 minutes in that patrol car, right? We're not talking about hours, right?
Yes, Your Honor. When you compare the length of Miss Vega's interview compared to the length of any other interviews that occurred during this case, hers is not only the longest, but is spent entirely in the back of a police cruiser. In addition to that, Miss Vega was questioned twice. There's a line of questioning that occurs outside the vehicle and inside the vehicle. Miss Vega is the only witness in this case that is questioned twice. Especially, what I find especially suspect is the fact that Miss Vega's, even after Miss Vega gives contrary testimony to Miss Tony DeLuca, they don't go back and reconfirm with either Miss Tony DeLuca or Miss Vega.
You mentioned that there's another officer outside the car.
Yes, Your Honor.
Is that right? How far away is he?
I believe in the case material it said 15 feet.
Okay, so approximately between you and me. Is that right?
Yes, Your Honor. I'd say that's a fair assessment.
Okay. And he's out doing whatever outside the vehicle. We don't know, right?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. And he can't hear what's going on in the vehicle. He can't add to the conversation what's going on in the patrol car, right? And so you're saying that the second officer that's 15 feet away at night that has no idea what's going on in this vehicle is somehow adding to the intimidating atmosphere?
Yes, Your Honor. He's a second uniformed officer on the scene, and he's placed himself in such a position that, say my client were to have terminated the questioning that night and left the police cruiser, because Officer Wright decides to let her out. Officer Jackson had placed himself in a situation where he'd be more than capable of confronting my client as she attempts to leave, possibly with more questions, more concerns, a different line of understanding from what's going on. And he's placed himself in this position where even if my client was able to leave the police cruiser, she has a second officer that's potentially between her and whatever business she intends whatever course she intends to pursue leaving that vehicle.
Okay.
Also, Your Honor, we have to talk about, in congruency with People v. Hearn, the length and form of questioning. And again, there's two lines of questioning that occurs. There is one outside of the vehicle that is, according to the case material, almost nearly identical to what occurs on the inside of the vehicle. But what happens is... 1 minute? Thank you. What happens is on the inside of the vehicle, it's a much lengthier, more pursued course of questioning that occurs after the officers managed to isolate my client in the back of a police cruiser. In addition to that, Your Honor, we look at U.S. v. Craighead, and we'll see that in that case they established that the simple recitation of the fact that a person is allowed to leave during a situation that might be considered custodial is not enough to keep that question from being custodial. And what we have here in this case is the officers not even attempting to meet that benchmark, what we would consider the minimum. If the officers had made that effort, had told my client she was allowed to leave, we wouldn't be discussing this right now. And for those reasons, Your Honor, the defense respectfully requests that you grant this motion and exclude the statement after the question becomes accusatory from my client's testimony.
Thank you.